I'm a prison guard at a maximum security prison. Every day I walk through the halls, checking in on the inmates and making sure that everything is under control. But this one night changed everything. It started as a typical night shift, and I was making my rounds through the cell block. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise coming from one of the cells. It sounded like somebody banging on the walls. I quickly made my way over to the cell and shone my flashlight inside. What I saw was disturbing. The inmate was lying on the ground, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. I immediately called for backup and the medical team to come to the cell. They rushed in and started performing CPR on the inmate, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead shortly after. I thought that it was just another tragic accident that happens within the prison, but then other things started happening. Other inmates in the block began acting out of character, becoming aggressive and more violent towards each other and the guards than usual. We often had to use pepper spray and physical force to restrain them. But the strangest part was the way they were talking. They were speaking in tongues, uttering phrases that nobody could understand. It was like something had possessed them. I started to feel uneasy every time that I walked through the block, like something was watching me. I chalked it up to the stress of the job, but things only got worse. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a faint whisper coming from one of the cells. It was too quiet to make out what was being said, but it still sent chills down my spine. I shone my flashlight inside, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off and continued on my way, but the feeling of being watched had lingered. As the weeks went on, more strange things had started happening. Doors would unlock and open on their own, despite no one having access to the keys. Lights would flicker on and off, even when there were no electrical problems. But the scariest incident happened one night when I was alone in the block. I heard something coming from the end of the hallway, and my heart rate spiked as I looked around, trying to see who or what was approaching. I couldn't see anything, but the steps grew louder and closer until they stopped right behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I was completely alone. The next day, I requested to be moved to a different block, but my request was denied. The warden told me that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I knew that something wasn't right. The incidents continued, and I began to dread going to work each day. I could feel something evil lurking in the prison, something that I couldn't explain. One day, I was walking through the block when an inmate grabbed my arm. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "You can feel it too, can't you?" I froze, unsure of how to respond. "Feel what?" I asked, trying to play it cool. "The darkness. It's taking over and it won't stop until it consumes us all." Yeah, that was the last straw for me. I put in my resignation that next day and never looked back. I don't know what's going on in that prison, but I know that I didn't want any part of it. I seem to be a magnet for creeps and weirdos, and since I got such a positive response on my last experience, I figured I would share a few more with you all. I'll be writing in order of let's not meetness, so scroll to the end if you only want the scariest. A little bit of background. These all took place outside my home at the time, which was on the literal last block of a major city, right across the street from the beach. The building was framed on 4 sides by the beach, the woods, a construction site, and a few other sleepy houses, as well as a muni line. Think the subway but above ground. It's the very last stop on the muni, so unless you catch it at the right time of the day, or at the height of tourist season, the area is basically empty on the sidewalks. The house itself has an initial patio door, which doesn't always fully close if you don't slam it, and then an entry area with a staircase and leading up to a second locked door that leads to the apartment. My first experience. I get home from work one day at about 9 p.m. and immediately get into a small spat with my roommates. After about 30 minutes, I decided to leave and cool off a little bit. I had planned on sitting on the porch outside, but as I looked across the street at the ocean, I decided it would be more peaceful there. I had never been to the beach at night for safety, but as I looked at the well-lit parking lot and no one in sight, I decided it would be alright. In the 1-block span from the beach to my home, there was a little wooded path that started on my street and dumped you out at the crosswalk for the beach. It also intersected with another pathway that took you down the coast. I sat for a bit. Everything was fine, and after a while, I started the 1-minute walk back on the little path. All of a sudden, I look up and see a man walking briskly on the intersecting path, looking right at me. I speed up a bit and try to ignore him, and as we hit the section where the two paths intersect, I end up being about a foot away from him. He calls out to me, "Hey, I want to talk to you." I ignore him, and after a few more steps, he reaches out his hand and grabs a part of my hair, saying, "Hey, come here." I immediately yank my hair out of his hand and I book it the last block, sprinting to my house, and I can hear him running behind me. I turn the corner sharply and I am briefly out of his sight. Luckily, the initial entryway to the patio has been left open by accident, and I run in through the door and I slam it shut. I hear his footsteps stop outside, followed by silence. As I go upstairs and I look through our front window, I see him walking away into the construction site. Experience number 2. I had a friend that lived a couple blocks from where I was, along the same stretch of beach. After hanging out one day, I decided to head back home around sunset. I've walked this way many times and it's just barely light outside still. Only a 5-minute walk, so I figure that I'll be home before dark. As I cross the intersection from their house, I notice a white van parked in the corner that is not usually there, covering a little garden I like to look at on my way back. I can just barely make out 2 people in the front seat. I think odd, okay, whatever, and I pull out my pepper spray. I cross the street, passing the van, and now have my back to it. As soon as my foot hits the pavement, on the other side of the street, I hear the van start up. I turn my head just slightly and I see them, illegally turning onto the street where I am now walking. They creep the van beside me slowly, just behind me but within my peripheral vision. I decide to stop and let them pass. I paused and pretend to be looking at my phone, and I see them stop driving immediately. This was a big nope from me and I broke into a run, the van following me, to a small vintage motel about 1 building away, that I know has an open entrance courtyard. And so, as I approach it, I turn quickly into the yard, and run up to an archway entry for a unit. I stop at the first few steps, catching my breath, and I open my phone front camera to use as a sort of mirror to see what the van is doing. They had backed up to the entry of the motel, and sat there for a few minutes. And then the one on the passenger side opened the door and started walking towards the motel, his phone flashlight on, and I immediately pulled my own phone back, listening for his footsteps, and readying myself to start banging on the motel door, hoping someone is inside. I wait in silence for a long time, long enough for it to get dark. I finally look out again, and both the man and the van are gone. I call an Uber to take me the last 2 blocks. Sorry, Uber driver. I never saw them again. My third experience. I had a friend over and we went to do a dab. It's a form of smoking weed. It was about 10 p.m. My roommates don't like dabbing in the house because of the smell, so he and I go to his car parked out front. We're in the car having a good time when I notice a person walking down the block, pulling on car door handles. I notify him and we watch as the same person comes up to his car and yanks on the back door. He honks his horn and they back up for a minute, and then walk up to his driver window and knock on the window, making a motion to roll it down. Just as I'm about to tell him, don't, he rolls down the window a bit. The person is clean and normally clothed and asks what day it is, and then what time it is, and to which my friend answers. And then they stand there and stare at us as he tries to usher them away, even offering them money. Without saying anything, they walk away down the block, and once they reach the intersection between the construction site and the woods, they roll their head back up to the sky and just start screaming at the top of their lungs as they back away out of sight. I take this opportunity to dart back inside my house as my friend watches, making sure to close the patio door. A few hours later, one of my roommates comes home very drunk, and as we had figured out later, they failed to make sure the patio door is shut all the way. Morning time comes and I wake up in an empty apartment. I open my phone and have a singular message from my roommate from 3 hours ago, stating that when they had left for work this morning, there is a person they didn't know sleeping inside the patio area. They thought that it was a drunk person who lived in the neighborhood, and they had entered the wrong house by mistake, and evidently did not find it enough of a reason to call me or wake me up. I immediately go to the entry of our apartment, pulling the door open fast. To my surprise, the person who had been talking to us in the car the night before is laying casually across my staircase, fiddling with something. I scream, "Hey!" loudly, and they immediately hop up and run out of my patio door. I run down the stairs after them and open the door. They are standing across the street, just smiling at me and giggling. They then give me a little wave and they run off. I close the door hard and go back up the steps to see what items they had left. Sitting on the steps was a few coins, some weird wire-type objects. Think a bobby pin after you bent it into a straight line, a lighter, and a pocket knife. I never saw them again. Unrelated to my stories, but shortly after I had moved from that area, a teenage girl was abducted from that same corner where I saw the van. And 2, after a car chase, police found a severed head in the freezer of a house along my block as well. Now I gotta find the article for this one. I also got a lot of questions regarding calling 911 on my last post, and I wanted to clarify. I am from a rural area, and I have had many bad experiences with cops abusing power, and I have been raised to always be wary of the police. I have also had situations that were severe enough that I did need to call them, and they didn't help me. So that is not really a thought that goes through my head when dealing with these situations, and I've learned how to take care of myself or utilize community resources for other situations. These all happened years ago, and it's all pretty wild to look back on, and remembered how terrified I felt in these times. So there's my stories. I hope you all enjoyed. A couple years ago, I used to attend a boarding school in Singapore. This was for the last 2 years of high school, or junior college as we called it. I'm a Catholic, and since none of my friends in the boarding school were practicing Catholics, I attended Sunday Mass on my own every week. If you've been to Singapore, you know it's one of the best countries to go around on your own. It's sometimes even more fun than going around with other people. So this wasn't something that bothered me too much. This Sunday in question came before a long week of submissions and tests, so I was already stressed to begin with. On top of that, I had also somehow managed to oversleep. I liked attending the 8 a.m. Mass. It's the one with the best choir. So I had to splurge on a cab instead of taking the bus like I usually do. I only got a limited amount of money for the month from my parents, and I spent most of it on food. So by the time I had walked into church, I was upset and just looking for some peace. I guess the stress made me look frazzled and upset, which might have been what caught his attention. As I was late for mass, I had to stand at the back of the church with the other latecomers, as there were no open seats left for us. This man was standing a few feet to my right. He was wearing spectacles and an eternal frown. He was Chinese, like almost everyone else in the church. I noticed him scowling at me throughout the mass, but I ignored him on purpose because I didn't want to get upset unnecessarily. I was the only Indian in my boarding school, so I was used to receiving weird looks. It didn't help that the area in which my school and also this church were located was a pretty rich neighborhood, and I had never seen an obviously non-Chinese person in the church. So the too long don't read is I was used to be a stared at minority. I refused to pay this guy any attention though. What happened next took place during a lull in the mass, during the distribution of communion. Many people tend to move out of the church after receiving communion, so a seat opened up near where I and the man were standing. I moved towards the tent after making sure there were no elderly around me who would like the seat. I sat there. The man maneuvered himself so that he was now standing behind me. This was when I began to feel unsafe. And then he began talking. His words were not directly towards anyone in particular. He seemed to be there on his own. The silence in the church only served to amplify what he was saying. Only in our section though, he wasn't speaking that loud. Basically, apropos of nothing, this random guy began railing about how the Indians were destroying his beautiful country. He went on about how they were doing horrible things to themselves on the streets of Geylang, staking out their schools and hospitals, and making Singapore into a jungle. How the government needed to throw all of them out. He said a bunch of other things that I don't remember now. He also repeated a lot of the stuff, which is why it got stuck in my head. He must have said stuff like that 5 times, and maybe even switched it out for other horrible things. It was obvious that his words were meant for me. I turned around to look at him when he first began with a kind of, "Are you kidding me" face. He was staring at me, his face the stock image of hatred and rage. The people around him were shifting uncomfortably. I turned back around, shut my eyes, and willed him quiet. He didn't shut up. At some point, I began quietly crying. I wanted so badly to move away, to run out of the church, but I was scared of causing a scene and making people notice me in a way that I didn't want to be noticed. I cannot fully explain the absurdity of the situation. We were in a church. In some other section, the priest was still distributing communion to the congregation. The rest of the church sat in prayerful silence. And in the back, in this one corner, this random guy was spewing hate directed at a 17-year-old. And nobody said a word to shut him up. When the priest returned to the altar and had us rise for the final blessing, I took that opportunity to get out of my pew and move away from the man. But to my horror, he followed. The mass had ended by then, and people were moving towards the exit, as was I. But he followed behind me, raised his voice, asked me where I was going. That was when a lady in the vicinity said something like, "Don't say that to her, don't use those words." But when I looked to her, thinking that she would help me get away from this guy, she refused to meet my eye and moved away. We got out of the church, and I couldn't see the guy anymore, so I ran blindly towards the exit and in the direction of the bus stop. I couldn't think straight, didn't know what I looked like. I had no clue what was happening. I got to the bus stop and decided to get onto the first bus that pulled up, even if it was going the wrong way. I thought that I was safe, and I got my phone out of my purse. And then I turned around and, like a horror movie, he was there walking towards me. The only other people at the bus stop were a woman and a kid. I didn't feel confident enough to approach them, and asked for help, so, fingers shaking, I unlocked my phone and called my roommate. She answered the phone groggily. I had probably woken her up, and without waiting for her to say anything, I told her very loudly that a strange man had followed me from the church to the bus stop, and he had been verbally abusing me, and I didn't feel safe. The man who had been advancing towards me all this time went and stood with the woman and the child, who had also heard me and moved away from him. The bus pulled up, I got in, the doors closed, and we pulled away. In that moment, I was so overwhelmed by what had happened that I stood at the entrance of the bus, next to the bus driver, and just burst out crying. I don't remember what was going through my head. My heart was going crazy in my chest. I must have been having the worst panic attack. The bus driver and everyone else in the bus was staring at me like I was crazy probably. At the next stop, the driver asked me if I was okay, and when I couldn't respond, asked me where I needed to go. I gave him the name of my school. A passenger who had just gotten into the bus took me back out, explained to me which bus I would need to take, and asked someone also waiting at the bus stop to make sure that I caught the right bus. Somehow, I got back to the boarding school. I had left my roommate on call, and it had made her extremely worried. By the time I got back to my room, she had notified our mentor and had placed a call to the church to ask if I was still there and if they could find me. They obviously didn't know anything. So, I guess that's my story. I just want to clarify that besides this one experience, I have never felt unsafe in Singapore. And I'm not in any way trying to post that all Singaporeans are bad towards Indians. This did shake me thoroughly though, and I could not bring myself to go back to the church for a long time. I truly hope I, or anyone else for that matter, are never placed in a similar situation ever again.